So, nuclear terrorism. Wow. We're going to examine 4 questions. How has the interest in nuclear terrorism ebbed and flowed since that should be 1945. I need to change that. Technically, 1945. Why are we so worried about nuclear terrorism by non-state actors? How much of a threat is nuclear terrorism with nuclear weapons? And what are some other frightening nuclear terrorism threats? In other words, I think what we're most worried about is someone with a ski mask in Peoria with a nuclear weapon that he sets off. And or worse yet, Times Square, you know. But somebody with one who sets one off. Is that it? Is that all we should be concerned about? How likely is that? We'll look at all those questions, and why don't we plow through? When I get done with this, we're going to jump to intelligence. I tried to think about, well, what is the connection between these 2 topics? If anyone can come up with that, please speak up when I do the transition, okay? They may not be tightly related. However, the reason you're getting this is when I went around town, and when I do go around town, and ask what are the topics that the staff needs to be smarter on, this was on the list. Okay. Okay, so the short answers are the ebb and flow of interest can roughly be measured as a 4-time phenomena since 1945. There was a little interest initially, and we'll talk about that. What could you do with a nuclear weapon? It really, however, is a phenomena that's slaved to garden variety terrorism. When something is active on the terrorist front that is non-nuclear, we jump and think about, well, what if they had an A-bomb or an N-bomb or an H-bomb? Yeah? So you see a spike in the 70s, 90s, and obviously after 9/11, and we'll get into that. Well, why are we so fascinated with non-state actors in nuclear terrorism? I mean, after all, and we'll see this, we can remember from the previous lectures, there were terror attacks during the Second World War. I think President Trump referred to North Korea as threatening us with a terror attack with nuclear weapons. So states apparently can do this. But why are we so fascinated with non-state actors? I think it's because it challenges more profoundly the legitimacy of the government. And, if it comes under attack. And I think it also undermines sort of the key, or one of the keystones of our national security, which is the notion of nuclear deterrence. And this has to do with being able to attribute attacks and mete out justice. I mean, frequently, I think it was the Bushes were very adamant about saying, well, justice will be served to the terrorists. Well, okay, but you got to know who they are. Terrorism, by its very nature, has, as they say, not a great set of addresses. I mean, it takes a lot of effort. Now, maybe that is the connection between terrorism and the intelligence topic. Intelligence tries to get the addresses, and actually, okay, here is a connection. I figured it out. The connection between the 2 topics is you're not really interested in knowing exactly who perpetrated a dastardly deed and exploded some important place, like, I don't know, a bomb going off in Congress. If A, they exploded with it, knowing everything about that person after the explosion is not as interesting as knowing that he might do it, and that he has an address, and you could look him up and, perhaps talk to him in a way so that he wouldn't go to the Capitol to do the explosion. So, I mean, there's a time element to the value of intelligence, and knowing about things late. It's not that it's worthless, it's just it's not as useful to prevent what it is you don't want to see happen. All right. So nuclear deterrence requires attribution. This kind of cuts against attribution, undermines the whole idea that nuclear deterrence is going to protect us against a lot of the things we care about. If this is the number one threat, nuclear terrorism, our number one security system, or one of the key dimensions of our security system, doesn't really do a great job addressing this. So, reason to focus on the non-state actor. In answer, how likely is it that a nuclear weapon will be used in anger by a terrorist? It's getting more likely, but it's not very likely, and we'll get into that. But other kinds of attacks with dirty bombs, more likely. I mean, we have some evidence that someone was interested in these in a way where it resulted in something being deployed, if not set off. Attacks on civil nuclear plants, we'll get into that. That's happened in lots of different ways. And Irredentism, which is a very fancy word for someone trying to seize control of a government by seizing control of certain assets. And this is sort of a side shot, but whoever controls nuclear weapons in a country might be able to get the attention of the government to do certain things, or maybe could take over the government. All right. So a little history lesson. First, if you take a look at this book, which I recommend, it's on the, I think, recommended reading list. It was written in '46. It is the scientist movement's, sort of calling card. I think that's the reason they put this together. One of the chapters is called On the New Technique of Private War, and it's a chapter on how an individual could use a bomb to really cause a lot of mischief. That a spy from a country could come in and do something as an individual. And it raised the specter that you see actually discussed in a sentence or two in the Atchison-Lilienthal report, that there may be a problem with terrorists or individuals who are not associated with the state, that they might actually be able to get nuclear weapons and use them. So the thought was at least there. I think there's a book that H.G. Wells wrote. My memory is fading on me here. Is it A Free World or None? Something like that. Say again? No. But it is a story about, written, I think, in 1914 about nuclear weapons, which is kind of fun because they hadn't invented them yet. Science fiction can be useful. But it talks about the problem that these things would be loose and someone might get them as well, even if countries use them. So there was some thought to this early on. I don't think that's the way we thought about nuclear terrorism, though, particularly. I think it more was driven by a picture that looks like this. We were about the Soviets coming in and setting something off, a country. There's a chair here. I mean, you have to look at me. I mean, there's a bit of a downside to it, but you can't sit. Okay, that's all right. And please feel free to get some food. Yeah, well, come on, there you go. All right. All right. These were considered terror bombs. They were done by states. So when we go back to '46, I think even though they talked about individuals, primarily they were worried about states, and using these weapons to hit cities and terrorize Now, that changed. I mean, I'm looking out here, I'm trying to think. See, I'm 67 years old. Anybody even close to that age? No, I don't think so. Oh, you are? You think? Okay. You hide it well. If you're as old as I am, you can remember when the country was different. You walked in to the Capitol and Ralph would have a security outfit on, but no gun. He'd help you double park. Yeah, it's a little different than it is now. Literally, that's how it worked.
Or riding down Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House.
Oh, through,
Yeah.
next to. Yeah, all those things that are walled off, you could walk through or drive through. But more than that, you could go to an airport and they didn't really do x-rays particularly. I remember the neat thing is you could take a shuttle, and it was a shuttle. You would go in, and every half hour there'd be something going up to New York, and, you know, up until 10 minutes before the departure flight, you could get right on the plane. It was easy for terrorists to do what they now threaten to do. Not only that, but something happened in the 70s which probably nobody can get their head around unless they're old. It's called television. In 1960, does anybody know how much national news was covered at 6 p.m. in this country? How many minutes? 10. There was a debate, should we go any further? Unfortunately, that was the beginning of the end. The answer was, sure, you know, it should have been, nah, we'll make people read, you know. And they decided, no, well, this feels good, let's go with it. And you can make money. The reason I bring up both of those points is when the terrorists decided they wanted to get noticed, it was easy peasy. And the amount of terrorism that occurred in the 70s vastly eclipses what we're currently experiencing. And I know, we're not supposed to believe that anything is as bad as it is now, but it was worse. A couple of factoids. During the decade of the 70s, you had close to 10,000 incidents and 7,000 murders. In the U.S. alone, you had almost 1,500 and 184 killed. Now, in contrast, just to get you head around it, a total of 214 acts of terrorism were cataloged between 2002 and 2013. Killing 61. Well, you know, you could say, you know, still 61 is a terrible number, but it is less. And I think we don't realize that things actually at one time were worse. My favorite factoid, which I picked up last night preparing this lecture, is, well, terrorism actually, deaths dropped 27% last year. Now, it's hard to see because of the news and the way in which we focus, but relatively speaking, what terrorists are most interested is not a lot of people looking at a lot of dead people, but a lot of live people looking at a few people making a statement by an act that doesn't necessarily involve a large number of people. Now, this is changing. In other words, in the old days, we used to wear a T-shirt. I'm not putting up with this anymore. Now we go in and we get a gun and we kill 10 people because that's how you get on the news. That and people are crazy. So, you know, things are running downhill, but we still are not caught up with the 70s. I just thought that, you know. So that's point one. But point two was when this uptick in terrorist activities occurred internationally and nationally, the mind immediately went back to one world or none and said, well, what if, I always like to say, what if Napoleon had an H-bomb? What if, the South, had nuclear weapons? What if the terrorists had nuclear weapons? And you think, God, wow, whoa, your head explodes, right? And so people were concerned about this. There were two books and essays that I think were probably really important. Also, back in the 70s, people read a lot, but not a lot was published. It was hard or difficult to get something into print. There were no word processors. Books were printed as a result of melting lead and forming individual letters on a linograph machine. Editing required typing over and over again until you got it letter perfect. It took time. Now, the consequence of that is people actually kept up with the literature. Even though there wasn't much of it, you read it all. So if you published something back in 1970 or in the 50s, it was a big deal, and you had a big impact. Now, any of you can publish an op-ed and get it nationally posted. And if you can't, I can, with 10 minutes training, I can show you how to do it. And so the signal-to-noise ratio is just real low. Back in the day, you got something published, and particularly if it was someplace respectable, holy cow. It made a big difference on public policy. So, Ford Foundation, big deal. Rand, ooh, big deal. Okay. And what did they argue? They said, well, it's not that difficult to make a bomb and get through IAEA safeguards. IAEA safeguards are they're not guarding that well. And Jenkins, wrote this piece. Well, the terrorists won't go nuclear, probably, but there's a big debate about this. Now, it was in the news as a result. It was in the air, popular culture. That's when somebody who wants to get the attention of the president says, well, maybe what we should do is threaten and extort. Get this, they only wanted $200,000. I guess, the economy was smaller then, but still, it seems like a paltry sum now. Threaten the president. He claimed a nuclear weapon had been placed somewhere in Boston. And of course, what do? Oh, well, you call the people who are expert and you say, go look for it. Now, the idea that you can find a nuclear weapon because, you know what you're looking for and you just send them into a city. Wow. They had radiation detection gear. Well, that's good. I guess the gear arrived at a different airport than the experts, so that kind of slowed things down. They had to rent a fleet of vans, and they kind of went around the city, but they didn't have the tools to install the equipment in the vans, and it's kind of embarrassing. So it didn't even really fail. It was so bad. Of course, it turned out to be a hoax. But what did Ford do? He said, well, I don't want anyone to have to suffer the embarrassment of this. What if it was for real? So he created the Nuclear Emergency Search Team. And this is their patch. If I have to tell you, I have to kill you. Now, it's somewhat reassuring to know that they've never had to really tell us anything because we haven't had a nuclear terrorism incident with a nuclear weapon yet. But they're ready, I guess. We'll come back to that at 9/11. Now, this man is not anybody that probably people remember unless they worked with him. He was not an easy person to work with, let's put it that way. He's now passed. But he was an extremely enthusiastic supporter of the export of nuclear technology and atoms for peace and backer of industry, the nuclear industry. And he had a position at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and later as ambassador at large at the State Department. And one of the things that was going on in 79, 87 was a lot of really nasty worries about proliferation. Iraq. The beginnings, if you will aware of Iran. Libya was a worry. India, Pakistan. By 87, North Korea. We were worried about Taiwan and South Korea, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa. Well, when you're in the midst of a really important proliferation crisis and you're wanting to promote nuclear power, what do? You change the subject. This is the father of nuclear security. It's an interesting origin. He said, well, what we really need to worry about is terrorists stealing material. Now, the advantage of focusing on that immediately is one thing, and that is you can get everyone to agree to it, even your enemies. Well, I don't want someone stealing my stuff. Now, you probably can't get them to say what they're doing exactly or where their stuff is, for obvious reasons. They don't want to be targeted. But you can have a lot of meetings, and you can have a treaty, and you can, well, wow. The Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material was negotiated during this period. It was the precursor of interest in so-called nuclear security. This is where it came from. All right, now, all that was theory, but then we had another uptick in terrorist activity. Did anybody live through this? One hand, okay? One hand, two hands? Technically. Is that right? Well, it may have left psychic scars. We don't know. Well, we had some really bizarre things happen. Waco, Texas, there was a cult, and of course the FBI, in its infinite wisdom, set things up so terrible, even worse things happened when they decided to set themselves on fire, or they were being assaulted. That was not handled well, but there were genuine problems. We had the Oklahoma City bombing, which was an individual, but boy, a lot of people were nervous about finding out who that was. I know initially everyone said, oh, it was someone who's Islamic. Well, it turned out it wasn't. But then you had this kooky group, Amnam Shinkro, that was actually interested not only in biological and chemical weapons and set some off, but was interested in maybe developing a nuclear weapon. Half-baked, but money. Well, I can tell you what happened as a result of these events. I remember being called by the chief of staff of, I think it was Senator Nunn's government oversight committee, and he said, well, I want to run something past you. I was flattered. I mean, my wife doesn't run everything past me, so I figured anybody else, I should take it, right? What? Oh, well, we're thinking of holding hearings on nuclear terrorism. And I said, well, why? Well, we need to focus on this threat. I said, why? Is it for real? Well, there's a lot of interest. I said, well, there'll be a lot more when you hold your hearings. Is that really in the interest of the country? Well, what about biological and chemicals? I said, yeah, you're not spinning my fan yet. What is it that what do you propose to do? Oh, well, we need programs. I said, what kind of programs? Oh, well, we'll figure that out in the hearings. What had just happened in 1989 before those hearings? Does anyone remember something having happened in 89? Oh my God, wait a minute. That was the threat. Well, wait a minute, you got the Pentagon, you have this defense spending to deal with the Iron Curtain, and the Iron Curtain fell. Well, wait a minute, oh my God, how are you going to justify? What's the problem? You have this crisis, you have this enormous solution happen. Resolution of a big, big problem. China wasn't an issue. They were still eating dirt in comparison to what they're doing now. Now they're catching up with us economically. They're a reasonably wealthy nation in many respects. No, not then. There was no threat. Aha, hold hearings. Well, you'll be surprised that the hearings were followed by the Public Preparedness Program. DOE, DOD, Homeland Security later, big budget builder. Luckily, or not luckily, this happened. Because if it didn't, after a while, people go, well, wait a minute, come on. Do we really want to spend a lot of money on that? I mean, is it for real? This happened. Now, I think I had you read a passage from Graham Allison's book where he says that a month after 9/11, there was a report, kind of like the Ford presidency report, where they're in New York. Who's in New York? Well, Al-Qaeda. Well, why should we? Oh, that's bad, but, what else? Well, they have nuclear weapons. Really? Well, we better send that nest team. Oh, out they go. One of the reasons Graham argues we went to war against Iraq was that incident. I don't know how much weight to give that, but I love stories that are so good that they're hard to disprove, even if they're wrong. There's a part of me that wants to believe that story. I mean, I don't know what the truth is, but I do know that there was such an incident. It could be that, he, the president, did not want to ever have any other president discover that there were 2 or 3 people from Al-Qaeda with nuclear weapons. And so he decided to go to war to get rid of the terrorists. And so we did. Afghanistan, Iraq, ISIS, drone strikes. This you have lived, right? You're familiar with this. Well, it wasn't that difficult, given this, to then move to this. And you had statements, this is Mr. Obama, but in all fairness, I think Republicans liked saying this too. I don't think this is a partisan slap, but it kind of came to a head with his rhetoric. The most immediate and extreme threat to global security is nuclear terrorism. Russia doesn't pose the #1 national security threat. I'm much more concerned when it comes to our security with the prospect of a nuclear weapon going off in Manhattan. I remember when the first thing was stated, and I was very friendly with the National Security Advisor for WMD, and I talked with him privately. I said, I hope to God you're not responsible for that statement. And he said, absolutely not. I said, good. We still can be friends. How can that be? Immediate and extreme threat. Trying to remember where in the lecture I give you my side story about my service on a commission on, you guessed it, nuclear terrorism, and what we learned. But before I get into that, this gave rise, basically to reports that, well, we really need to get big data on everyone, and not just foreigners, but people who are Americans, because you can't be too careful. Obama called for this. It certainly came into place. I winter in Utah. I've driven past this thing. It's massive. Now, I suppose the argument is, well, the data's there. It doesn't get mined unless there's an incident, and there are no names. But, this is a kind of engineering approach to intelligence. You get a regression analysis, and you do an algorithm, and you get what you need. Unfortunately, the algorithms sort of work. I say unfortunately because I imagine that much of Utah may be paved over with these facilities by the time they get done. I mean, there's no end to this. But it is driven by this assessment. Well, we had nuclear security summits, right? That was to deal with this. Do you know where your nuclear material is? Is it behind enough gates, guards, and guns? Can we agree that you will work harder to put it behind gates, guns, and guards? Sure. I remember when they held their first meeting, because they put in a speech, and the people who were putting the first summit together said, wow, you can't believe we actually pulled off putting this together, because it came out of Zeus's head. It just jumped out in the speech. Nobody was prepared for it at staff level. And I said, well, okay, when are you going to hold your next one? They looked at me, you got to be kidding, we're done. I said, no, you're not. This is your signature convergence project. You're going to be doing these at least every 24 months. Guess who was right on that one? They didn't like hearing that, though. But, I mean, they did not do any harm. I mean, you could say that they maybe distracted attention from proliferation. What is the criticism of Mr. Obama when it comes to North Korea? He didn't do very much. Now, I'm not sure what he could have done, so I'm not sure it's a fair criticism. But he was busy doing this. And this was the main event, not the spread of nuclear weapons. Okay, where do we go? Well, let me jump just a little here. No, I'll do that in the end. I'll save the best story for the last part. Okay, what about these non-state actors? And how well founded are our nuclear terrorism worries when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons? I've already gone through this. It's not like you can't do terrorist attacks as a state. You can. They did. They can again. It's a problem still, I think, maybe. I like these guys. Yeah, they call those V weapons. Does anyone know what the V stood for? Vengeance. That doesn't seem like a military objective to me. Oh well. Okay. Here we go. This gets good. Can someone tell me what they think the odds of a nuclear terrorist attack might be? By the way, there is no wrong answer, so please come forth with some ideas. Oh, come on.
Less than 5%.
Less than 5%, thank you. Anybody think it's more than that? You do. What do you think the number is? 100%. 5, 100. 5, 100. Oh, God, you're sophisticated. Okay. Timelines and probability. Okay. Did anyone take high school statistics? Okay. Well, you need to go take a look at your notes. Can you put an odd on an event that has never happened? By the way, there's a simple answer, and it is no. Bayesian my ass. They have places for people to say words like that, and it's not pretty. No, actually you can't. And so what's interesting, though, is there's a whole industry in coming up with the numbers. I mean, gotta love it. It's Harvard professor calculates that it was 29% within the next decade. There you go. There's your timeline. Very scientific. Do you know how he got that? He polled people like you, and then divided by the number of people. 29%. Actually, it was 29 point something. It was like, really? And the answer was yes. Yeah, well, there you go. Right. Then we have Graham Allison, the ultimate preventable catastrophe, gave the odds of terrorism American city is 50%. Now, I guess I am going to give you this story now. The National Intelligence Council tagged the odds of a WMD event within 5 years, this was in 2010, at 50%. Okay? I served on that commission when they briefed us, and I have to say, I am friendly with Graham Allison, so I can actually refer to this. And Graham Allison was on the commission as well. And when they briefed this, Mr. Allison shot up and said, "That's the first sentence of our report. We got to use it." And I remember raising my hand, and I think he yelled, "You don't have to answer his question." It's kind of like, under honors, I might put that down someday. I said, "No, actually you do. I'm on the commission. We're sort of equals, and you're supposed to answer a question." So I said, I, first of all, am not a statistician, and I only remember taking statistics as part of my high school education in arithmetic, basically, or math. So I'm going to ask some questions here, and I will defer to you. I said, I can't believe this number. There are only two possibilities. One is that you're very cynical and you're covering your tail for something that you don't know whether it'll happen, and you're putting out a number. I said, but believe it or not, as cynical as I am, and I'm pretty cynical, I think you know that already from my lectures, I don't believe the U.S. government official would do that. I think you're telling the truth, but what you think a WMD is probably includes something like, let me guess, an anthrax letter bomb that doesn't even go off or kill anybody. You couldn't see, these people's faces were so red. I said, aha, well, you might have said it that way, because I'll tell you what'll happen. If you put that out, people will say that there's somebody with a ski mask in Peoria about to set this off within 5 years, and it won't be a WMD, it'll be a nuclear weapon. And it absolutely was exactly what happened. I think it was Bill Perry who said, well, the National Intelligence Council said that, within 5 years, there's a 50% chance that a nuclear weapon will go off in the United States. Huh. Anyway, my favorite is Brian Jenkins. He did the same thing Matt Munn did. And what he did is he conducted a survey of 180 experts. And they asked him, he got a wider distribution. Do you know why? He called me. And I said, well, it used to be 1 in a billion. Now it's just 1 in 10 million. And so all of a sudden, you're going to play a game. Play it hard. Who knows? What's interesting, though, is the way we think about these things. And this is a very popular idea, that if there is even 1% chance, we have to treat it as certainty. Whoa. By the way, you're all going to have to strip before you leave so we can make sure you don't have a nuclear weapon. I mean, what does that mean? How do you bound that if you treat it as a certainty in terms of our response? Wow. This looks pretty modest, if that's how you view things. You can tell I'm not an enthusiast for this. I worked for him, by the way. I got an award from him, so it's not like I'm against him. I have a medal. I got a medal from him. So I have nothing against Mr. Cheney, but this seems a little unbounded to me. However, there is a reason why people talk like this politically. It is true that when you have terrorist acts and you're president, your popularity shoots up. People want to believe the commander-in-chief will solve it, and they want to support him. Bill Clinton, who, had had kind of a rough time politically for a variety of reasons, sees his approval rating shoot up to 56%, which today looks pretty high, I think the president's, got 39 to 48 or something, depending on which poll. So, 56 looks pretty good. Bush went from 50 to 90%. And even French Francois Hollande, who had a 19% job approval rating, shot up to 40 after a terror shooting in Paris. So this has a certain currency. I mean, you do not want to blow this off and get too cynical. This has political weight. All right. I think, however, we need to look elsewhere for the threat than the likelihood that a weapon will be used by a terrorist. I don't think that as much more likely as it is, it's still not very likely. However, if you look at nuclear facilities and physical attacks, this is what the map looks like. It happens. It has happened. There's an issue here. Chernobyl resulted, it's argued partially, as I've argued in previous lectures, in the fall of the Soviet Union. The government in Japan collapsed after 3/11. The politics of sustaining a hit and not having a good response, this is something one of my students is going to have to struggle with in this project, are enormous, or as our president would say, huge. If you want to bring down a government, maybe you do an attack or you induce an accident and you make it look like it's something that was an accident rather than an attack. Now, these are the Belgians. They're insider threats that are conceivable. We have somebody who worked for ISIS working at one of these plants. Well, there are a lot of people working there, different opinions about how to think about things. And then here in 2014, we got someone who drained the oil from the lubricant on some turbines. Somehow he got in there and was able to do it. Then you have the suspected link of the November 13 terrorists. And it was found that they had surveillance footage of a high-ranking Belgian nuclear official. What were they doing? Were they going to kill him? Were they going to do something? That nobody knows. Then there was a hacking. They had to shut down the Belgian Nuclear Agency's computer system. Individuals broke into Belgium's research reactor, blah, blah, blah. Now, it's interesting. Belgium's planning to phase out nuclear power by 2025. I don't know how connected these things are. I don't know. But this is not theory. I mean, in other words, this stuff happened. You can do a probability on this. You have data. Now, this is super interesting. As I explained earlier in the course, if you have a nuclear power plant, you need electricity to keep the water moving. And you need two separate routes of electricity into the plant to make sure that you've got redundancy. Well, out in California, somebody decided to use I think this is a very hokey picture, by the way. I don't think any of this happened. But they used a high-powered rifle and fired 100 rounds, wow. And basically, the transformer drained out, and I think it had the equivalent of something like oil in it, and you don't have spare transformers. They're really enormous things. This is something they're trying to remedy by having some spares on hand. But when you knock out a transformer, you knock out lots of avenues of electricity. Okay. Now wait a minute here. Let's jump to this. This is also something we know about, cyberattacks. There were cyberattacks against a Ukrainian reactor that shut it down. We know that we were working effectively to shut down 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz. there was a hacking attack targeting administrative computers, which, might have something to do with personnel. I mean, I'm not sure it had anything to do with the operation of the plant, but they're working at it here in Kansas. And then, of course, this is kind of fun. For those of you that are, perhaps not sharing my view that a big nuclear power plant in Saudi Arabia might not be the most secure thing to build, given that the Houthis are claiming they're going to shoot missiles at the reactor in the UAE. I don't think they can get there yet, but they've announced that's what they'd like to do. Well, how about this? Their petrochemical industry has been hacked by somebody. Could it be Iran? Who knows? That's a pretty complex system. Would that be a precursor if you built a nuclear power plant to getting hacked? I don't know. But these things are of some interest. Now, you've probably heard about dirty bombs. And here we're talking about probably only deaths related to the explosion going off. The radiation is accelerating your death by giving you cancer. It's not something that's immediate, and it's a percentage thing. And so what you can definitely count on is the real estate values around the Capitol, if one of these was set off, would go way down and stay way down for quite a long time. Same thing in New York. So, I mean, this is a nice terror weapon in the sense that what people make of it is easily as awful as what happened. I don't want to trivialize getting cancer. As someone who has had cancer, and I hope I don't get it again, it's not fun. But this is a little more sophisticated than kinetically being blown away. What's also interesting is that the most effective radiological materials like cobalt are the kinds of things that if you work with, you should be dead by the time you set it off. So there's a kind of, prophylactic built into some of this stuff. However, as you go down the half-lives, you get beyond cesium and things like that, you can work it. And it has. Now, these things were not set off. So I don't know whether that's a data point or not, but it shows more than the malice of intent, I guess is what I'm thinking. These are in Chechnya, 95 and 98, and they found one and were alerted. Bomb never was activated. Similarly, they found one and it didn't go off. Okay. Gone through that. Okay, then there's just plain old garden variety, let's take a whack at a reactor. If you're in the Middle East and you're building stuff, it's going to be real hard to get a Lloyd's of London insurance policy. Why? Well, when you build one, you get bombed. If you're Syria, Iraq got bombed, I don't know how many times, by, let's see, the Israelis, the Iranians, the British, the Americans. This is Dimona, and it was bombed, or there was an attempt to bomb it by Saddam. He missed with a Scud. There were some maneuvers by the Egyptians in airplanes that certainly raised concerns very close to the facility. Here are our Houthi friends. Bushehr was attacked by the Iraqis and hit. Okay, so that's quite a record. Now this is the most sophisticated point, and it probably is the weakest part of the brief. It is true that Al-Qaeda has attempted to rush after or into facilities or take over a ship that had nuclear weapons and nuclear materials. We do not know that they were going to get the weapons and set them off. However, I would think had they taken control of these things, someone would absolutely be fascinated to get a phone call from them. And if they had demands, it would cause you to listen. Similarly, we had a coup not that long ago in Turkey, and there was some concern, when the lights went off and we didn't know who was going to be in control and custody. In other words, at a minimum, you could argue that getting control of nuclear weapons allows you to have leverage to get control of the government. A slightly different point. On the other hand, if you think they were going to set off a nuclear weapon, maybe the read is, oh, well, they're going to get these things and set them off. Take your pick. Most people looking at the Pakistani situation are more concerned about the stability of the government than they are about nuclear use. And they do see control of these things as an issue politically. Okay, last story. Got 30 minutes to do our intel. What about the threat of nuclear theft? As part of this commission, we were dragged over to the CIA at least once or twice. And the question was the same. Have you found any evidence of a terrorist trying to get a nuclear weapon or no? And the answer that came back is, well, we're spending X percent of our budget on this. And it was I think, a pretty big number. But no, we haven't. No specific intelligence. That means intelligence that you can act on because you have time and location and attribution. Now that admittedly was in 2010, that's 8 years ago. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's still the case. Okay, ready for intelligence?